Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I was writing an email to a gentleman this morning and realized his question is a question that I get not frequently, but on a fairly regular basis, and would make a good subject for a video. So I'm going to do this instead. So I have his email here. He says, "Hey Ian, I am the executor of a gentleman's will who wanted his collection to go to a museum which would keep and display his lifelong pursuit. It is a substantial collection, mostly Civil War era black powder, his real passion, but includes a smattering of modern arms through Vietnam. Flags, knives, bayonets, and many other accoutrements are part of the collection, including a cannon and a swivel gun." Kind of cool. Most museums have indicated they do not want duplicates unless the item has special or particular provenance. One of this gentleman's stipulations is that the collection remain together and on display. After searching 30+ museums specializing in firearms, I understand that the majority only display a small portion of their collections. Would you have any recommendations for a museum who would take a collection like this one, not separate it or sell it off, and display at least a revolving part of it on display? And this is a question that I've gotten like fairly regularly. Not sometimes from executors, but more often from people who are thinking, I'm getting pretty old. I want to preserve my collection. I've spent a lot of time building it. I'm very proud of it. I think I've done a really good job of creating this fascinating historical collection, and I want to see that preserved after I'm gone. The problem is this is essentially an impossible request, and I thought it'd be worth talking on video about why it's so impossible. Now, to begin with, when people put together a collection, they generally have a theme to it. And the first hurdle you're going to have to overcome is finding a museum whose theme matches the theme of your collection. If you go to the US World War II Museum and you say, "Hey, I have this collection of 1,000 guns that I'd like to give to you to, keep together, not sell off and display, and my collection goes from the Civil War through Vietnam." Well, the US World War II Museum is kind of in a bind. Like, they can't take your collection and display the whole thing because they're a World War II museum. And finding, the American Military Museum of Small Arms from the Civil War through Vietnam, you're limiting your number of museums here. Most museums have a particular focus. So that's the first problem. Find a museum that actually matches the theme of your collection. And this is difficult with collections that are very broad-ranging, and it's also difficult with collections that are very focused. Let's say you had, I don't know, a collection of French military rifles. Well, there aren't a lot of museums, especially in the US, that have a very specific focus that would be interested in displaying an entire collection of French military rifles. So it's not like you can focus on, very narrow or very wide theme. You're kind of screwed either way. Now, the second problem is people will very often insist that the collection be kept together, that it be displayed, and that it not be sold off. And this puts museums in an impossible situation. First off, if you have a substantial collection and you want it all to be displayed, you're going to have to find a museum that has a lot of open space. Like, where are they putting your stuff? Are you giving them enough money along with your collection to build a new wing to house your collection and to maintain it, in perpetuity? Almost certainly not. That's not something that people tend to think about. And they also think about, well, my collection's really good. It deserves to be in that museum. And I'm not saying it isn't, but that museum has to balance your collection with all the other stuff they have. So if they're going to put your 500 guns up on the wall, 500 guns they already have are going to have to come off the wall. So whose guns come off the wall, especially if the last guy who came in had the exact same requirements that you do and insisted that his collection be kept intact and on display? Well, if his is on display, then yours can't be. What if yours is better than his? What if the next guy who comes in is better than your collection? Museums have to have the freedom to pick and choose between what they display, what they think is most appropriate for their organizational mission. And then we get to the question of selling items always comes up. We've kind of accepted culturally that museums shouldn't ever sell off something. Like, a museum is supposed to be a permanent refuge for historical items, and once they're there, they're safe and they're preserved for for people to see. And the problem is, part of that's true, but part of it really becomes logistically problematic because museums don't have enough space to display all the items they have. virtually every museum out there has more items in its reserve collection than it does actually on display, because they get a lot of things, especially successful, well-known museums. And it takes a whole lot more space to actually put items up on display, where they have to be protected, they have to be lighted, they have to have interpretational information with them, signage, and maybe more, where, and there's limited floor space to put all that stuff. It's a lot more compact to put it in the reserve collection down in the basement, where you can stack things nice and close together. They can be in the dark, they're better off in the dark. You don't have to have glass around them. You can put way more stuff in the same floor space if it's not on display, and that's what most museums have. And if we then take this notion that items have to stay in a museum once they're gifted to a museum, what we end up with is this gradual accumulation of all the good historical items in the basements of museums where nobody actually ever sees them. And in my opinion, it is in fact better for the collecting community, better for the historical community, to have a lot of these items actually released from museums. Museums need money to operate. I don't think there's any reason that museums shouldn't be allowed to sell off items. Obviously, there needs to be some level of control by the museum organization itself. You obviously don't want some rogue curator to go in, sell the entire collection for pennies on the dollar to his buddy. Essentially, you don't want them to be able to pull an R.L. Wilson, sell the stuff off and make a huge profit on it on the side for individual people associated with the museum. But it's really unfortunate when items get essentially trapped forever in museums. A really good example of this would be the Springfield Armory National Historic Site, which has a fantastic U.S. small arms collection, all sorts of really cool experimental prototype stuff. And they display a decent amount of it. They have a really nice display. It's smallish, but very well covered. It's a well-designed exhibit. But then up in the reserve collection, they have, for example, dozens of American T-48 FALs. This was from when the U.S. was, the trials between the M14 and the FAL. And all these FALs ended up at Springfield Armory. And, they can put one on display, and they've got literally dozens of essentially identical rifles, and they can't do anything with them. Like, they can't even trade them to other museums because of the limitations that people with good intent, but don't think all the way through. And it does no good for all of these identical guns to be in one museum's reserve collection when they could be spread out. I don't remember which, one of the European museums, Danish maybe? I don't remember exactly, but they ended up coming across a cached container of well rods. And they had like 50 well rod pistols. And they were in the same situation because of the rules set for, the museum cannot get rid of artifacts once they are in its inventory. Well, they couldn't get rid of, they could have otherwise used these well rods, which are really cool and very interesting pistols. They could trade them out to other organizations in exchange for things that they don't have. Springfield could trade these guys a well rod for a T-48 FAL if both parties were interested, and then they'd both have something new and interesting to add to their collections and to show to their visitors. To bring this back to personal collections, if you are donating your collection to a museum that is a substantial firearms museum, the chances are probably about 100% that a fair number of the items you have are already duplicated in that museum's collection. And is there a good reason for the museum to keep multiple duplicates of the same item? This is why, referring to the gentleman who emailed me, this is why when you wrote to museums, they specifically did not want to get duplicate items, because once they come into the museum, they're essentially stuck there forever. They can't get rid of them, and they take up space, and they prevent the museum from taking in other objects that might be more interesting or more pertinent to the museum's mission. In my opinion, if we rethought this a bit and allowed museums, with proper guide rails in place within the organization, to sell off duplicate items and items that didn't meet the museum's mission, it would be better for everybody. I think I know a tremendous amount of the actual historical scholarly research that's done on firearms, and I can't really speak to other collecting historical areas, but when it comes to firearms, there's a small minority of the research that is done by actual museums. The vast majority of the research out there is done by individual private collectors. They're the people who have the time and the resources to dedicate to a very specific niche sort of subject and write books like the ones back here that allow everyone to learn more about these specific areas of history. And if all of these historic guns are captured up in museum collections, it's that much harder for the individual historian collectors to get access to them, to understand them. A lot of this information comes from widespread public ownership of the different artifacts. A particularly good example of this would be Japanese rifles. Understanding the dating and serial number system of Japanese rifles was originally I mean, this is decades ago, but this was figured out by a group of private collectors because they had a huge number of Arisakas in private collections that they could essentially assemble all this data together and figure out what is the relevance of these characters in front of the serial numbers on Arisakas. All of the original factory records had basically been firebombed out of existence. And we understand the system now because of private collectors. And had those guns all been in museum back collections, which they would have been because they're all duplicates of each other, essentially, a museum wouldn't be putting out 10 different guns that are all basically the same except for their serial number prefixes. The scholarship and the research comes from the private sector, and that's where the guns are better off belonging. Now, obviously there is a place for particularly historically relevant individual examples to be in museums. You know, if you have George Washington's pistol, yeah, absolutely. There's no reason that shouldn't be in a museum, but it also ought to be on display. Okay, anyway, I'm starting to ramble now. To bring this back around, if you have a private collection and you're trying to figure out what to do with it when you pass away, you're going to have an extremely difficult time finding a museum that is willing to take it on. In fact, I'll just say flat out, it's going to be impossible to find a museum to take your collection and actually keep it as a complete collection, display it, and not sell any of it, because frankly, it doesn't do anybody any good. I understand that the collection has significant value to you, the person who created it. You created it for good reason, and you understand why. But that reason, that value isn't going to mesh with the value of any existing museum out there. So if you're dedicated to having your collection preserved, what you need to do is endow your own museum, or possibly find a museum that's willing to take an endowment for a new wing to hold your stuff. And then you might have a chance. But if you don't have the financial resources to make that happen, I think it is far better off to allow your collection to be dispersed, split up, and sold, where the component parts essentially become recycled back into the community at large and allow the creation of other collections. These guns don't go away. They group up into collections and then they disperse out over time. And that dispersal is what allows other people to build their own collections that may have the same focus as you or may have a slightly different focus. But I think ultimately, while it may not be what a lot of us want to hear about our own, the fate of our own collections, we are all just temporary custodians of these things and need to accept that they'll go on to other temporary custodians. There's an ebb and flow to it. Anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. This was kind of a short notice thing because I thought, you know what, I do get asked this a lot and I think it's worth commenting on it in public instead of just responding to this one gentleman by private email. So, thanks for watching.